the Windows servers, not SQL, need to participate in the same Windows Server cluster. Now let's level set. I'm not saying that we have to cluster SQL Server on all 4 servers. Instead, all 4 servers that are participating in the availability group, they all have their own standalone instances. They all have their own direct attached storage in this scenario. But these 4 servers do need to participate in a failover cluster. So I'm going to open up our failover cluster manager, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a cluster. And off to the right, I'm going to just select create a cluster. And we have our nice welcome screen that we'll be seeing with every wizard. And we're going to enter our server names. And so we'll enter in server 2, server 3, server 4, and server 5. Once we've put in all the servers that need to participate in that particular cluster, we'll select next. And this is where I'm going to deviate from what you'll probably do in your production environments. I'm not going to run validation. I've already run validation behind the scenes. I don't think you want to see this happen. It will take minutes to tens of minutes. So we're going to just say, no, we don't need to validate. But within your production environment, it's very likely that you'll run a validation test to make sure everything will proceed correctly with your cluster. So we'll say next, and we'll give our cluster a name. So we'll say always on cluster. Oops. And assign an IP address for that resource. It's going to give me a confirmation and run a validation, just making sure this should work correctly. And we'll confirm, and it will create the cluster. What you're seeing is if you haven't done clustering in Windows Server 2008 or 2008 R2, clustering has come a long way. It's much easier to build. It's much easier to deploy. And as you'll notice, in just a couple of minutes, I was able to put together a pretty general standard cluster. And we'll open up our nodes, and we can see all 4 of our servers are now within the same Windows cluster, and they're all up. Now, I mentioned SQL is not clustered. We don't have any services that are part of this cluster. That's not the requirement for my scenario. Now, I mentioned there were 2 requirements. The first is that we have Windows cluster. All 4 servers are part of the same Windows cluster. The second requirement is a little easier. That is where I simply need to change a setting or change a property within Windows Server to enable a service. So I'm going to right-click in my SQL Server Configuration Manager, and I'm going to right-click on my instance and say Properties. What you'll notice in the very back, we have this brand new tab. It's called Availability Groups. And when I select that group, it has recognized that this server is part of a failover cluster, and I just need to check this Enable Always On Availability Groups. And when I say OK, it's going to say I need to restart the server, and we'll restart our server. Personally, the idea of connecting to every single server and enabling a service sounds less than fun. So what I prefer to do when there's something that I need to repeat and repeat across multiple servers, I like to think about other tools to automate. And in a configuration management solution, I often think about PowerShell, how I might be able to use PowerShell for this. And you'll be very happy to see that all of the capabilities to manage and deploy always on, we've been releasing and making a lot of new commandlets to support this for PowerShell. We're going to be using the Enable SQL HADR service. And I'm just going to pass this in to my 3 servers and get that service enabled. So we're going to open this up in PowerShell, and we'll let that complete. So that's just going to take maybe a minute or 2. So while that's completing, you'll notice that my server 2 in Management Studio is in the process of rebooting. And once that's rebooted, we'll just start our availability group. Here we go. So we've got our 4 databases. We need to put these 4 databases together into a single availability group. You can have multiple availability groups within a single instance, but each database will only participate in one availability group. And whoops, let's refresh this because that's all gone. Okay, so under availability groups, what we're going to do is we're going to right click and say New Availability Group Wizard. And we have our welcome screen again, and next. So we're going to start by giving our availability group a name. This is just our logical container, how we're going to reference this group of databases. And we'll call this Always On AG. And say next. Now, with my availability group, as I mentioned, I can basically group together multiple databases. So if there are only 3 databases that are participating or that support a single application, I can select those 3 databases, or if it's only 2 or 1 database, that's fine as well. So I can select or deselect as many as needed. And then I move to the next screen. This is where I will express my intent. So we talked about the business rules, how I need to have the 4 servers and multiple secondaries, and some of these secondaries I need to support read activity. So I need to add each of those server instances into my wizard. So we'll go ahead and add 3. We're going to add another replica for server 4. These are all my SQL instances. And we'll add another replica for server 5. So we've got our 4 servers, 2 that are in Minneapolis, 1 in the Southwest and 1 in the Northwest, all that are going to participate for our always on solution. My primary is going to sit on server 2, and I have secondaries available on 3, 4, and 5. The replica mode is where I will specify how that replica will be participating in this group. We mentioned that in Minneapolis, we're going to set that up with automatic failover, high availability. So we'll maintain server 3 and server 2 with automatic failover. Server 4, I can choose either high performance or I could choose high safety. These terms might resonate very well with you if you've done database mirroring in the past. High performance is, as you can see down below, an asynchronous commit availability mode. So this is our async, similar to async mirroring in 2008 R2. High safety is our synchronous availability mode that only supports a manual failover. We're going to just make both of these high performance. And we'll move on to our final intention. And this is how will our applications be able to connect to these secondaries when it's not the primary node managing that availability group. And we can either disallow all connections, so you can only connect to it when it's in a primary state, or I could choose that I would like to allow read connections. There are 2 options for read connections. One is allow all connections. Pretty much any connection can come in and issue, select, or read statements against that database. The second is that it will only allow those connections that have a property set on the connection string saying read intent connection only. And so we can choose to have a little bit more control within our environment by specifying that. We're going to allow all connections with both of these, and do be aware that even though we're allowing all connections, if that database is in a secondary, it's in a read-only mode. So even if we're allowing them to come in and try and issue an update or an insert or a delete, those statements will in fact fail. Only read statements will succeed. And before we do our final validation and we start building our availability group, the wizard is simply going to ask, do you want me during this, when I execute these statements, to perform the initial data synchronization? You have a choice. You can either skip the data synchronization and do it on your own. So basically set up the availability group, but After the group's set up, you would do your own process to restore with no recovery and then join that secondary database to the availability group. Or you can say, go ahead and perform the initial data synchronization. The most obvious answer is for very large databases, you probably want to skip the initial data synchronization. You may not want that restore, the backup to happen to a share, the restore to happen over your network. You might want to coordinate that more directly. These databases are small, so we're going to go ahead and say next. And it's just done its quick validation, and here's the summary. So here's everything that the wizard is going to put together. If we wanted to, we could select script in the bottom right-hand corner, and when the script comes up, we could look at the script and see the SQL CMD that is creating all the endpoints. We scroll down, it's in fact creating the availability group. We can further scroll down, and you'll see that it's backing up the database from the production and restoring it to the secondaries, and then backing up the logs and restoring the logs. And finally, it alters the database and adds it to the availability group. We're going to let the wizard run this so that we can watch all that fun green checkbox activity. So if we check more details, this is where we can see all the fun little green checkbox as the processes are completing on each of those secondaries and on the primary. So this just takes a few seconds. So in roughly, less than 10 minutes, we've been able to set up a cluster. We've walked through and talked through setting up the availability group, and on the completion of this, you'll be able to see that we are able to look at our new availability group. So in Management Studio off to the left, you'll notice now under availability groups, I've got my new Always On AG. As I open up Always On AG, I now have two additional folders. One is availability replicas and one is availability databases. And these are just the server instances, SQL Server instances that are participating in this availability group. And these are the databases that are participating in the availability group. So if I were to fail over to any of these particular instances, all databases would fail over as a unit. If I wanted to manage, if I wanted to manage a little better the health of this particular availability group, I can right-click on the group and select Show Dashboard. And this will give me a nice view of the health and wellness of my environment. And as this refreshes, you'll notice it will return back the information for each of the server instances that are participating in each of the databases. As we scroll to the right, you'll notice that we've got hyperlinks we can select for any issues. Right now, they're all returning healthy, and I could click and see what does healthy mean. When I select what does healthy mean, it in fact will show you that there's a policy that's running behind the scenes. So we are using policy-based management to help raise alerts and maintain the health and wellness of our environment. And these policies are in fact available under the policy-based management node in Management Studio. And there are some aspects that you'll be able to adjust on those if you wanted to fine-tune these for your environment. So we've set up our availability group. We've been able to see that everything is running very well and healthy. If we want to just close up some of this stuff. And what we're going to do is we're going to insert some data. So we've got our database. We're connected to the primary. Down below, you can see Always On Server 2. And if we select and do our insert, you'll notice we had nothing to start. We did an insert of 4 of our Twitter wits, and we now have those Twitter wits available in our table. We can select the read from one of our secondaries. So let's pull open our secondary, and we'll connect to server 3, and we'll do our select from server 3. And our Twitter wits are available in that table as well. And I've also returned the server name that I'm querying from. If I wanted to try and do an insert to that secondary, you'll remember that this is in a read-only state, so it's going to fail any inserts or updates or deletes. So so this is going to return an error, but it does allow me to offload reporting with a very low latency, almost near real time, and we'll talk more about that as we get back to the presentation. So the final piece of this puzzle is, we're certainly able to connect to our primary directly, but our applications shouldn't need to have the intelligence to be able to say, well, which one in fact is the primary, and do I need to connect to, server 2, or is server 3 now owning that availability group, and gosh, where do I connect? In Windows Server clustering, today, we've got this wonderful thing called a virtual server name, and gosh, it's very easy. I don't have to know which node owns that database. We have that same notion now with availability groups. What I'm going to show you and how I'm going to show you how to create this particular new virtual network name. This experience will be changing as we get into the release of the product. In its current state, the DDL is not yet available in SQL Server to create that availability, or to create that virtual network name. So we need to do that through the failover cluster manager, but that functionality will be available as we look at RTM. Gopal Ashok and his team are working fervently to get that into the product right now. It's just not available in my current build. So what we're going to do, we're going to go back to our failover cluster manager. And first of all, we'll notice that as we look at services and applications up above, we have a new service and application called always_on_AG. That sounds very familiar to our activity group name. We can right click and look at the properties and in fact see that this is a new resource type of a SQL Server availability group. We never had to touch clustering when we were creating our availability group. Once the Windows Server cluster was set up, we were fine. All of this was created through the DDL within SQL Server, so you will not need to go in and create these availability groups manually. If, in fact, you wanted to, excuse me, in fact, you wanted to, you could, off to the right, add a resource, and you could select more resources, and you see below there's a new availability group. But just about every time you interact with this, you will be doing that through the DDL in SQL Server. That same experience will be coming with what we're about to do right now, but we need to do it manually through failover cluster manager. And what we're going to do is add a cluster or a client access point. And this is basically giving me a virtual network name. We're going to call this WIT, always on WIT, and we'll give it an IP. It's going to do a validation to make sure that all of that should work. And then it creates our virtual network name. And once this is finished, we'll see we have our new server name, and we're going to right click and just say bring this resource online. So while this is coming online, this just takes a few seconds. We'll go back to Management Studio. We're going to open up Management Studio and say we want to connect to our WIT. So we'll pass in, whoops, always on WIT, do our connection, and you'll notice that we're connected to WIT. We can see the 4 databases that are part of the resource group. This is basically a subset of the databases that could be available on your production system. It will be those databases that are part of that resource group. So if we come back to our SQL CMD and let's instead connect to WIT and we issue our select statement, you can see that yes, we're connected to server 2 behind the scenes. And what I'll do is we're going to force a failover. So we'll open up maybe 5 here and go to our replicas. And what we're going to do, we're going to right click on server 5 and we're just going to say failover. We're basically instituting a manual failover like you would see with database mirroring, forcing things to move all 4 of those databases to move ownership from server 2 over to server 5. This experience takes a little bit longer in the current build, and those are going to be improving as we move forward. So what I'm going to do is continue. I'm still connected to WIT. Oh, and now we are connected to server 5 behind the scenes. We can also then issue our inserts and our updates and our deletes all through that virtual network name, and we don't have to worry about knowing which one is the primary owner. And so we've now added SQL Queen 2, and that should be actually SQL Queen, which is Kaylin Delaney, our Twitter wit, into our table. So we'll go back. And bear with me 1 second. We're going to bring up that PowerPoint again. So we've here we go. There we go. We've gone through a lot of the new capabilities that we have with Always On, and let's just kind of do a recap. The Always On availability groups. This is essentially a nice marriage of database mirroring and log shipping. Plus. That was actually something I've heard Gopal say, that this is like a database mirroring plus. And it very much is. It provides you all the flexibility and integration and efficiency that we need to manage our mission critical applications. We can support multi-database failover. So this isn't no longer, what we have with 2008 R2, where it's a single database mirrored to a single database. These databases are logically kind of in a container, so that when one database feels it needs to fail over, the 4 of them fail over together. And as we talked about, this supports multiple secondaries. You saw that through the demonstration, and you can have up to 4 secondaries. 2 of these may be synchronous secondaries, and you can have 1 automatic failover pair. And it has a very nice flexible failover policy. As you also saw, we have made some really nice investments for the application redirect. Really important to make that configuration wizard an easy experience, but also something that even if you didn't want to go all the way through to the end and let the wizard finish, you can use that script as a launching pad to build your own configuration script for your environment. The dashboard is very essential for managing this environment and using those policies to help understand where you might have health issues or configuration issues that you need to address. And you'll be seeing a lot of very tight system center integration. And of course, PowerShell automation. We've been seeing a lot more with Denali, a lot more of our embrace of PowerShell. I'm sure Aaron Nelson out there is doing cartwheels, because he's been saying for the last couple of years, we need more PowerShell. So this is a great tool and resource for those who prefer to use that PowerShell environment to deploy this off to their production environments. And of course, active secondaries, being able to read from the secondaries, and as you'll see soon, even more. So as we recap, just we're going to dive into the architecture just a little bit and see what key pieces make up the solution. If we take an example of any 3 independent machines, and they have their own storage, if we're going to build a high availability infrastructure that allows a custom application to fail over, there are some very essential things that we need. Fundamentally, we need coordination of inter-node health detection. We need failover coordination. We need to know who's the primary, and is the primary healthy, and is there something I need to do about it? There has to be a distributed store for the states and for the settings, and there needs to be this change notification coordinator. Basically, we need a traffic cop, some layer of software or technology that can do all these things, acting as the traffic cop for the 3 individual servers. In database mirroring, we had the concept of a witness server, but this had a limitation of only being able to support 1 secondary. To build out the support for multiple secondaries, we made the decision to leverage Windows Server Failover Cluster, which is already supporting all these functions. So it wasn't like we needed to build out all these functions. It already was built to support these functions. I just showed you how easy it is to deploy a failover cluster, and the Windows Server team has really made some great enhancements and advancements on making that experience much easier for all of us. What I do want to point out is that database log synchronization, that's coordinated directly within our data engine part, because obviously that's not going to be best managed by the failover cluster. And I also want to point out that this is not something that we're moving on our own. The Microsoft availability platform, this is a very common pattern that we're seeing for lots of application and infrastructure scenarios, from Exchange to Hyper-V to what we've been doing for many years with failover clusters. And what you also saw, we have made secondaries readable. That's a real great boon. You can offload read queries to the secondary. You can offload reporting to the secondary. This is going to be close to real time, but I want to also emphasize there is some latency. There will always be a slight lag in the freshness of the data, regardless of whether you're configured for synchronous or asynchronous. The synchronous or asynchronous time, that applies to the time when we harden that change to the log on the secondary. But there's also this asynchronous redo thread that's happening on the secondary that will refresh the pages on the secondary. So the latency of the data on that secondary for reporting, that's going to depend on the time of that data page refresh. This obviously is not going to be a great latency, but there will be some latency depending on your application scenario. And I also want to point out that we will be enabling backups on the secondary, and this is something that's even just of late come up with one of my customers who had a requirement that they needed to back up on their secondary systems, a very large database that's in a mirrored configuration. And with Denali, you'll be able to back up both primaries as well as secondaries. It can be synchronous or asynchronous. You can do logs from any of these environments. And there will be this nice new recovery advisor that's going to help simplify the restore process. That is not yet available in the current build that I showed you today. Otherwise, I would have loved to show you that. And we just have a couple of minutes that I'd like to talk through some of those key enhancements to failover cluster. As I mentioned, we now have native support for multi-site clustering across subnets. This is something that was introduced with Windows Server 2008 R2, and we will be supporting it on SQL with Denali. I alluded to this flexible failover policy at the beginning, and this is really going to improve those experiences where you might have a false failover condition, or if you wanted to have less tolerance for certain kinds of delays like a deadlock. You can configure this across multiple levels to listen for your kinds of events and failover according to your configuration. And the final thing I do want to call out is that TempDB within a failover cluster will be supported on local drives. And the reason this is such a key enhancement is that TempDB it's becoming very resource intensive, particularly for very large mission critical, highly transactional database systems. And we've had a lot of really nice enhancements with SSDs, and being able to leverage those SSDs in a local drive will really be a big advantage. And the final call out for what's coming in Denali, you can read through these bullets, but the one I really want to call out is we are supporting SQL Server on Windows Server Core. This is going to reduce your OS patching, and what I've been hearing is a conservative estimate of 50 to 60%. This could really reduce the planned downtime that you might experience whether you go through Patch Tuesday or any other kind of patch process, by reducing the number of patches you need to apply and the number of patches that may require a reboot. So really look hard at the Windows Server Core capability and see whether, as Denali is released, if that's something you'd like to take advantage of with your mission critical applications. So CTP1 is out, and if you wanted to download it, I'll show you a link in just a bit. But what you saw today is not all available in CTP1. So I'm going to call out that I was using a much later build. I wanted to be able to show you a lot more than what might be available in CTP1. But what you can do in CTP1, you can certainly configure the availability groups and use T-SQL, Management Studio, PowerShell. You can put multiple databases into an availability group. You can create multiple availability groups, manual failover, readable secondaries, but it will only support a single secondary in CTP1. The multiple secondaries is coming in a later build. So as I mentioned, we have a fantastic resource center. This is where you can get links to where you download CTP1, as well as if you didn't want to set up your own demo environment and play with CTP1, you can start reading about it by visiting the sites and looking at some of the nice white papers we're putting out. If you don't want to write down this website, then just go ahead and do a quick search and do a search on Always On Resource Center.